Howdy, Chess College. How y'all doing? How's the eclipse? Did it treat you well? Did you stare directly in the sun? Are you completely blind now? I'm afraid I overslept and I missed the whole thing. Oh well, next time, if there is a next time. Hope you're all doing well. It is Wednesday, the 10th. We're still doing cinema. Hope you saw the quiz. It's posted. It's due this Friday, so watch the film Easy Rider Raging Bulls. It's a documentary. I'm going to talk about it tonight. So if you listen to me, you might get some hidden answers. You never know. Because we're continuing with cinema the rest of this week, and then we'll do other things for the rest of the course as we go into our later one more month of school, essentially. I hope you're doing well. I finished a bunch of essays today, and I'm impressed. The playwrights, um, the modern painters. I'm glad somebody picked Frida Kahlo and playwrights like Sam Shepard and uh, and the rest. I'm learning a lot. Um, I've still got to stress the fact that it always says 3 to 5 pages. That means a minimum of three. You have to do three. I do take points off if I see less than three. It's a discipline, like everything else. Um, so please fill the page. These people you're writing about, thousands of pages have been written about them. And so writing three shouldn't be that tough. And I don't want just a standard bio taken off a Wikipedia's page. I want the reasons why they matter. And it's usually because of the art they're making, not about where they were born or where they went to high school, but what art they created. And so if you talk about the art, you'll do well. If you just talk about when they were born, who they married, who where they went to high school, not so well. I'm not looking for standard bio descriptions. And then you had to do something unusual. You had to look at the silent film, the kid, and give me your opinion of it. And a lot of you did. I think you did well. Um, Everybody mentioned the fact that it was silent and is black and white. Of course it was. They didn't have color film or sound film when Chaplin did that. But that's all right. You guys are new to cinema. It's okay. If you talk about the story, what you got out of the story, the humanistic angle of the story, it's not just a comedy. It's a lot of pathos in it. That's what made Chaplin so great. Then you will capture the essence of that film. And I hope some of you might watch more silent films. You'd be surprised. All modern cinema is standing on the shoulders of those films. And but he was inventing it. Those old films, they're inventing it right then and there. Hadn't been done yet. And so he has a long fantasy sequence in there. He's in heaven. He's got angels and everything. And they had to do that um, with real special effects. I know it looks kind of hokey and corny now, but really it works. Um, and his little tramp was classic because it was always about the underdog, the guy who was outside of society. And that's why it was such a successful creation, because I think a lot of times a lot of us can relate to that. Anyway, so cheers to you guys for writing some good essays. Thank you. Now, in the 1960s, the quiz, that documentary I've asked you to watch, you're going to have to watch the whole thing in order to answer those three simple questions. Um, Please look at the instructions, follow them clearly. Each bullet point them or number them 1, 2, 3, so I could grade them real easy. Each question's worth 5 points, so 15 total. You have until this Friday to finish. That's plenty of time to take a quiz. Um, in the film, what you see is the end of the Hollywood system. The studio system was failing. Um, they had lost their audience, mostly due to a lot of factors. Television was one. People were staying home watching TV. It was free in those days. Yeah, you had to sit through the advertisements, but it was worth it. And the civil unrest of the times. We have the assassinations of our President Kennedy, his brother Robert, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, all within a 5-year period. This shook the nation. The Vietnam War was raging, very unpopular war. There was a draft. You could be drafted into the military if you're a young man. From anybody from 18 to 26 was eligible. They used to have student deferments. You could stay in college and you wouldn't get drafted, but then they canceled those later on. Um, so there's all that going on in the culture. The civil rights movement is going on. Black Americans are finally getting their day in court. They're finally getting the right to have regular lives like white people. They could vote. They shouldn't be lynched. They're still being lynched. Yes, that's right. Jim Crow was still a law in some states up until the 70s. You can actually legally murder a black man for the offense of looking at a white woman. So that was very real. Black artists, musicians of all sorts had to stay in separate rooms, had to stay in separate hotels, couldn't eat in certain restaurants in the deep South. And this was going on all the way up until, hell, maybe it's going on now in a certain way. Um, and the music was changing. The music changed with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Then we had later on Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the Jefferson Airplane. The whole rock and roll youth culture erupted, and Hollywood didn't know how to handle it. They were still making these kind of adult, hokey kind of musicals, the Hello Dolly, Darling. Um, they didn't know what to do with the youth culture. Roger Corman was a brilliant producer, visionary, and he came along and started making low budget movies, biker movies, beach party movies, anything with rock and roll in it, horror movies that appealed to the youth market. And he would put them in drive-in movie theaters. At one time, there was 6,000 drive-ins across the country. Um, People love going to drive-ins, and there's a market there. Hollywood didn't understand that market, but he did. He thought the youth, people under 25, like going to the drive-in. So he made these movies specifically for that market. Really smart. Um, a lot of famous people came out of his movie factory. People like Francis Coppola, who directed The Godfathers, Apocalypse Now, Martin Scorsese, who's still directing everything from Raging Bull to Casino to Goodfellas. Um, Steve Spielberg, Ron Howard, the actor, got his start Eat My Dust, with low budget, what they call exploitation film, um, through Roger Corman. He employed a lot of famous people who weren't famous yet. People like Jack Nicholson and Brewster, and they all worked for him. Nobody knew who they were at that time. Peter Fonda, he gave them jobs. Peter Bogdanovich, who went on to a director who wanted to direct some Last Picture Show and other films, who just died last year. They hired him to be an everyman on The Wild Angels, a movie that Corman made about the Hells Angels with Peter Fonda. And Bogdanovich got to do a lot of things, from anywhere from helping serving the lunch to helping rewrite the script with no credit. So there was an opportunity there for young filmmakers who were coming out of film schools in the 60s. We didn't have film schools in the 40s or 50s. 60s, we started having, you can major in film at universities, NYU, Columbia, UCLA, uh, USC. People like Steve Spielberg and George Lucas went to film school. So did Coppola and Martin Scorsese. The generation before them, there was no film school. You had to go to Hollywood and work your way up. And these filmmakers were young. They had something to say about what's going on with their generation, and but they were locked out of Hollywood because Hollywood was still saying, "We know better. Listen to us." And so, but they didn't know better. They didn't understand the youth market, and guys like Roger Corman did. And he would hire young people to start shooting movies about the things that are important to them, to the youth market. And and once they started showing a profit, then Hollywood woke up. They still didn't know what to do. And in the documentary, you'll see um, how the auteur directors, that's these new directors, Hal Ashby, Robert Altman, Sam Peckinpah, like I said, Coppola, George Lucas, and Steve Spielberg, and so many others came up, mostly men folks. Women still were kind of outside the door. They came up and were given an opportunity to pitch a movie at a studio, and if it made, they'd pitch it, they'd get a three or $400,000 budget, and if it made them money, Hollywood loved that. They understand money. A movie that busted everything wide open was Easy Rider, directed by Dennis Hopper and produced by Peter Fonda, starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper and a young Jack Nicholson. Um, about two bikers who make a drug deal and drive across the country to celebrate their supposed freedom in New Orleans. And of course, it goes very, very bad. They get murdered by a bunch of rednecks in the South who don't like those long hair hippies flaunting their new wealth. So the movie had a great soundtrack, a rock and roll soundtrack that was popular hits of the day. It wasn't, they weren't written for the movie. Dennis Hopper had his record collection. He just started putting the music in there. They got permission later. And those songs became literally the soundtrack of my generation. We all had the music. We loved it. We saw something we related to and we wanted to be a part of. Also, what was influencing us besides the Vietnam War and civil rights and women's movement, where women were finally getting equal pay. They're still not getting equal pay, so we're still fighting for that one. Um, Feminism was starting in a big way, so they could have a voice in the culture that mostly kept them pregnant as housewives and housewives. They weren't having in it. They wanted to be artists and filmmakers and musicians, just like the men. And it wasn't until Easy Rider came in, they made the movie for, as someone said, 300,000 to $600,000. They went on the road with their cameras, mostly in state of New Mexico. Um, when I lived in Santa Fe during the 90s, they had filmed out there, and in Taos. It's in the movie, and it's very much a part of the culture out there. The movie Easy Rider, and it went on to make $100 million, which is huge profit for a $500,000 movie, and made everybody, a lot of people, rich, and made them more famous. They got to be able to direct more movies. It started Jack Nicholson on his incredible career to what, to where he was went from the drunken lawyer in Easy Rider to the Joker in Batman, um, all because of these low budget movies that came through Roger Corman's influence in his hands. But these new directors were also on fire about wanting to tell a new kind of story, um, that they got the opportunity to. But it wasn't until their movies started making money that Hollywood listened to them because they didn't know the youth market. They couldn't understand our obsession with music and the Vietnam War. They just didn't understand it because they weren't a part of that. Um, Also, during this era, there was a film movement. I can't talk about it 'cause it's too much to cram in 1 week. That came out of Italy after the war called Italian neorealism, bicycle thieves and Rome Open City that had never been seen before. People took the cameras on the streets of a war-torn Rome right after the occupation of the German Nazis, and they filmed these humanistic stories with a lot of times amateur actors, and it opened our eyes to what a film real life looked like, not a Hollywood studio facsimile of a real life, like most Hollywood films up until that time were. And a little later, and then Federico Fellini came in and did his La Strada, and Kurosawa from Japan was doing his Samurai and Rashomon, and it was starting to pop internationally. People had a story to tell in a new and different way. Then there was the French New Wave, started in France in the late 50s by auteur filmmakers who started as writers at Cahiers de Cinema. It's a film magazine, and they took films seriously. They wrote about films not as an entertainment, but as a serious art form, just as serious as Picasso or a Rembrandt or John Steinbeck novel. They took it that seriously, and it opened people's eyes to film criticism, what films really could achieve, and it changed everything with these young new filmmakers. And then they were inspired. If you ever watch Breathless, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, they filmed on the streets of Paris. Half the time they didn't have permits. They were just running gun. They called it um, filmmaking, and it became a huge phenomenon. The French New Wave. There were other filmmakers, Francois Truffaut, and many, many more. I can't hit every single one of them because we don't have time. You can read about them. It's all there on the great internet. Look up French New Wave. You'll see what I'm talking about. Anyway, their films were influenced by American films, but they didn't have the money we had. They didn't have the studio system or the movie stars, so they had to do it a different way. And they did. And it invented a whole new way of filmmaking that we hadn't seen before in this country. The French New Wave changed everything in the entire universe. We're still looking at it as the thing that changes films. Now, we're a long way from that now with all the superheroes, the computer generated imagery. It's way beyond French New Wave, that is for sure. But that's how influential these films were to these new auteur filmmakers. Auteur simply means the author of your work. Up until then, Hollywood film directors were hired by the studios. They were told what movies to direct, when they're going to be finished with them, when the next movie is going to start. They're under contract. The new generation of auteur filmmakers, which is covered in that documentary that your quiz is based on, wrote their own scripts, cast their own cast. They told the Hollywood studios what would make money. They took a risk. And when it did make money, the Hollywood studios listened. And it influenced an entire generation of filmmakers and other people. After the 1960s or late 60s, and I saw The Graduate, Easy Riders, and especially The Wild Bunch, that's what I wanted to do. I was only 18. I don't even know what a director did. And I remember telling my mother I'm going to go to Hollywood to be a director. I did do that. I didn't get to direct in Hollywood, but I worked on quite a few movies. I did get to direct my own films later on during the independent scene of the 90s, but I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico by then. So eventually I got to direct my own movies. I'm working on directing a movie right now called The Redeemers, from a script I wrote about a punk rock band that's all in their 60s and they're aging. And how do you age gracefully and play this raw, primitive music? Is it possible? Anyway, hope to film it here locally in Reading. I need help. If anyone wants to help on it, give me a reach call out. Anyway, but it's a serious deal. Um, I've made half a dozen films that have played around the country, and I'm still dreaming and scheming my next film. Um, on that note, along comes these movies that were made by people like Robert Altman, who had directed McCabe and Mrs. Miller, MASH, Nashville, The Long Goodbye, and Hal Ashby, who had directed Harold and Maude and Shampoo and Bound for Glory, and Francis Coppola, who did huge hit with The Godfather. Then he went on to do The Conversation and Apocalypse Now. Uh, they were on a roll. These auteur filmmakers, their movies were making money. And then in the midst of all that, there was a renaissance of black filmmakers, referred to as black exploitation. I'm going to post a documentary you should look at. Maybe you can write a paper um, about black exploitation, which started in about 1970 or thereabouts, with black filmmakers who had a story to tell. Hollywood wasn't listening because the audiences for black exploitation were in the inner cities of Detroit, Chicago, New York, LA, and Hollywood doesn't understand that demographic. That's not their demographic. Um, so black filmmakers started making films for a black audience in the inner cities. Well, you know what happened when they made movies like Shaft and Superfly and Badass, Sweetback Badass? Um, what happened was white people showed up to see these movies, white college students. That was unusual because these movies were hip and cool and they had great soundtracks by Isaac Hayes and Curtis Mayfield. And they were drawing a white audience also. Hollywood saw that these small budgeted movies for 100, $200,000 were making millions at the box office with this inner city hip crowd that they didn't understand at all. And so, of course, they came crashing in on it, and they hired a bunch of white directors to make black exploitation films, and they messed it all up. And within 5 years, that scene was dead, mostly because white Hollywood did not know how to manage it. But for a minute there was a black renaissance in filmmaking, and then it was killed, literally. I mean, now we do have some black filmmakers, but it's been a struggle. So everything was going along hunky dory. It was a new era. Audiences couldn't wait to go to the movie theater to see things like The Exorcist or The French Connection. Um, any Peckinpah movie I was obsessed with. His Wild Bunch, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, Pat Garrett, Billy the Kid. He was making what they call anti-westerns, which were kind of dead at the time because we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. Nobody wanted to watch a western, but they're brilliant. And then along comes a small movie called Jaws by Steve Spielberg. He had made a couple of movies already, but this was his biggest movie yet. And it was based on a bestseller by Peter Benchley, and they filmed it on the East Coast with a mechanical shark, which was a big hassle to use, long before computer generated imagery. And the thing always broke down. And so you don't, if you watch the movie Jaws, hopefully you've seen it, you don't see the shark that much, which I prefer. I don't want to see the shark that much. I want to feel and fear the shark, not always see it. And so you don't see it much, but when you do, it really counts. And along with the music by John Williams that we all know and fear. I mean, maybe when you go into the ocean and you're way out there somewhere, do you ever think about what's below the surface, wanting to feed on your spindly white legs? Jaws was a phenomenon. It was the first movie to make $100 million in 1 year, and that became the story, not the content of the film. It's a very entertaining film. Not to take anything away from that. Very entertaining. It came out the same year in 1975 as Martin Scorsese's one of his greats, Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro. A very different, dark film. Way different. And there's Jaws. It's all fun and entertainment. And of course, that's the one that killed at the box office in a good way. And yeah, that became the story. Suddenly, box office became the story, not the content of the film or the acting, or the directing, or the writing, but how much money it made. And then 2 years later, George Lucas's Star Wars, and the rest, as they say, is history. Star Wars was a phenomenon, still is. They're still making sequels to it, prequels, sequels, and it blew Jaws out of the water. Pun intended. Now, people like Scorsese and Robert Altman don't direct movies like that, and they didn't know what to do. And so they made some movies that bombed. New York, New York, that didn't make the money back that Jaws did. And and then suddenly the studios thought better. They knew how to make a movie that makes money. They can make a movie like Jaws, they can make a movie like Star Wars, or they can make sequels. And that's what they started doing. The studio system took over again. They knew better. They weren't going to listen to these auteur directors who seemed to be all about their egos and their drug addictions and the whole generational thing. Now the studios took back control, and so the era of the auteur director, the door closed in about 1979 with a movie called Raging Bulls by Martin Scorsese, and then it opened it up to the 1980s, which became something that was just sequels. Many sequels for Jaws, Star Wars, Rocky, Superman, Top Gun. That became the hits of the day, bigger, better. What they refer to in the film as high budget B movies. Now, a B movie was always the second movie that played in the theater. It wasn't the A movie. The B movie was usually a low budget melodrama of some sort. And that's what they felt these movies were. They're kind of action adventure movies with a lot of money thrown at them, like Indiana Jones, but they weren't very deep. People weren't changing their lives over it, but they were being entertained with highly entertaining, big budget B movies. Talk about, I'll finish this off in a day or two when we talk about movies of the 90s and up till now. Hope you guys are hanging in there. Look at that quiz, take it seriously. Congratulations on the essays. I will talk to you later where the story of film, the story of the arts continues.